From Harvard to Esalen, The Social Engineers, Part 1 by James BraveWolf. Those who created Esalen. One night, not so long ago, I was taken into the city to meet the chairman of one of the largest oil companies in the world, a man whose ancestors controlled some of the largest banks in the history of civilization. He owned a brick building filled with paintings that were priceless. There were two others sitting with us, a woman and a young man. The young man began to talk about his trip to the Amazon and about a lecture he had just given at Esalen. Ayahuasca helped me find other worlds, helped me realize that my father was psychologically abusive to me in the way he denied my potential. Ayahuasca made me free. And the man looked at me and said, "You do not need ayahuasca, do you, James? You can fly all by yourself." What a shocking thing to say, I thought. How did he read me so quickly? And indeed he was right. I was not afraid of this man. I'm not afraid of anyone, because I am clean inside. I told him, no, I do not believe that drugs free you. I think they are a prison. And the man nodded his head. Yes, I would agree with you. Then why did you fund his lecture? I asked without thinking. It just came out. And he answered, because life is about becoming the last ism on the planet. And we have been working on this since the end of the war, and some of us even before that. Do you think Dr. Timothy Leary would have done what he did without money? Everything comes alive with money, and everything dies without money. He looked at me to see if I understood. How different I was from the social engineers. It is my heartfelt belief that the New Age movement was designed on purpose by social engineers whose ultimate aim was to splinter the very inner core of Western humanity, to render the human spirit docile, to plague our souls with such confusion that we would ultimately overheat and shatter, to never again find our true selves. And sadly, I lived in the town where this was planned and implemented. My father knew the change was coming. He was an outsider in my town because he smelled of wood and growing things. He told me once, there are those who do not plant gardens in their yard. They have lost touch with what is real. You need to be careful. There are always focal points in history, one place where all things meet, by accident or by design, and the world is never the same. Princeton was that place for the United States of America. In one small town in New Jersey, the American Revolution and the American Empire, as we know it today, was born. With the help of 3 homeless boys from Philadelphia who held the British off with cannons they had never fired before, an act of true courage and bravery, General Washington began the march to empire. And of course the atomic bomb was developed here, along with what is now called the CIA. Woodrow Wilson came from Princeton. He who helped divide up Europe in such a way that made sure another war would come. One small town held the destiny of millions and now billions of people. These social engineers with their political and military might dominated the material world. Their vision became our vision. Their loves and hates became our loves and hates. And then in the 1960s, another focal point was created where another group of social engineers began to plan the domination of the inner world of humankind, transforming all of us into their own image. The focal point for this was Harvard University and my little town of Wellesley, Massachusetts. The goal, the transformation of the whole world, that and nothing less. To do this, they decided the inner content of the human being had to be first eradicated and then rebuilt. They created Esalen Institute in California for this. Those who resisted the coming New Age would fall away into oblivion. Drugs and artificial religion used to subdue a generation. The demolition of the Western soul, the beginning of the New Age movement, began with the LSD experiments by Timothy Leary, who lived in the wealthy town next to mine. Instantly, This young professor had arranged to live in a Victorian mansion. It is important to note and never forget that no revolution can take place without enormous sums of money and access to media in order to spread the message. Dr. Timothy Leary had both. So who was it that felt our inner world needed to be destroyed and rebuilt, and why? I can answer these questions by personal experience. For me, the New Age was born out of anger and revenge against everything that came before. Absolutely everything. One of the creators and sponsors of the New Age, a man who now controls the biggest media company in the world, came from my town. The man who makes so many of your movies and music and television. I knew him as a boy. I rode my bicycle into his driveway, but that was as far as I could get. He would never allow me to step foot inside his house. I was not allowed. He and others like him understood that this generation of kids in the 1960s had such incredible energy and vitality that it could be channeled into the weapon of mass soul destruction they were looking for, to remake the human form. First, they had to get the attention of this living vitality and new strength. First, they had to take it away from the churches and the conservative impulses of society, the families, the landscape, and God. Then they would have to offer something to replace traditional society. It would not be enough to denigrate town and neighborhood, church and farm, landscape, homeland, and the invisible but very real bonds of family. They would have to create new religions by adopting older religions from the East, and introduce them into the new and powerful youth generation of the 1960s. But these were only empty shadows of those ancient traditions. Those with enormous wealth offered only window dressing. The social engineers found Alan Watts and Dr. Timothy Leary, and so they began. In the end, the generation of the 60s would be convinced that God did not exist. No individual soul existed, that we were all one within their new false Buddhism. Here is how they began to do it. They found a Stanford University graduate by the name of Dick Price. He came to Harvard to continue his study of psychology. After this, he joined the Air Force and lived in San Francisco. He met Alan Watts and then experienced what we are told was a positive, transformative, psychotic break. He spent time in a mental institution. Soon after, he came again to San Francisco and met another young man who had just spent time in an ashram in India. And so was born the ultimate germ to begin the infection that has become today the New Age. Dick Price called it the Esalen Institute. They created Esalen so that we would be always searching for something and never find it. Esalen was and is a place built to distract us from our own inner nature, created by the social engineers at Harvard to make us all run after their carrot. They created new religions at Esalen, false fronts, like facades. They created a Hollywood religion that looks so pretty, but is only cardboard. Behind it there was only a company lot where their accountants and change agents kept it all going. From Alan Watts and his Zen to the UFO phenomenon, from their new Buddhism to their caste-free Hinduism, all were empty creations. They were there to dazzle and confuse, and again, always leave you empty. And then the distraction became complete when they started to preach that ayahuasca, DMT, LSD, and psilocybin would lead to a better you. Losing my friends to acid. American banker and ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson brought drugs to the intention of the world. Please remember again that money and media is needed for all revolutions. Wasson, with the help of the biggest media outlet in the world, told his story about ingesting mind-changing mushrooms containing psilocybin. He is the man that first introduced drugs to the mass culture. Albert Hofmann then isolated the active principle psilocybin, and the drug company Sandoz from Switzerland began to market and sell psilocybin to physicians and clinicians worldwide for use in psychotherapy. Then came ayahuasca. The brew was first described in the early 1950s by, again, Harvard ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes. Many will think that these new drugs were opening up the doors of perception for humanity, leading them to the fullness of reality that was being kept from you by religion and a male-dominated society. But in truth, these drugs were the ultimate devastation of what you have always had within you. Researchers then and now, some that I know personally, conclude the effects of psilocybin are associated with decreases in activity in a number of key brain areas. Rather than the expected increase, this finding has led to speculations about the relationship between brain activity and mystical states experienced under psychedelic drugs. The more brain activity decreased, the more vivid the trip experienced. Thus the zoned out, fried look that countless thousands, perhaps millions of young people wore on their faces in Boston and New York and everywhere in between. Well, in the other part of my town, the financiers who backed this interchange were making a fortune on Vietnam, a war they had created for just such a purpose. Not that it really matters, but perhaps it does. Jim Morrison's father, Jim Morrison of the Doors, was the military officer in charge of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an operation designed to create in the American mind the absolute necessity of going to war in Vietnam, what is now called a false flag. Interesting that from one family comes this kind of social manipulation. The Doors so influential in the Esalen culture, and Jim Morrison's father so influential in the American military complex. Coincidence? Perhaps, or perhaps not. For me, I saw the first-hand true result of this inner revolution. In 1972, I was 13 years old. I remember going into the home of my friend. He had an older brother, a hippie, who had returned burnt out from California. The older brother spent a year in his room, hardly ever coming out. The first time I saw him, he was standing like a ghost in the living room. Without saying a word, he opened a plastic bag of acid tabs and shook the bag violently onto the floor. The tabs scattered everywhere, under furniture, into corners, absolutely everywhere. And my friends got on their hands and knees and scrambled to get as many tabs as possible. They pushed each other, desperate to find them for themselves. I watched them as if they were from another planet, as if they had instantly become so completely alien to me. I was a boy who did not drink a beer until I was in college. I never used drugs. I was afraid of them, intuitively afraid. I didn't want to lose control of myself. Even then, at 13 years old, I knew that my life, my thoughts, my dreams were mine and were sacred. I did not want someone or something else in my head. Drugs scared me. At 13, I felt that I would let something horrible inside me, something that perhaps would never come out if I did drugs. So I walked out of that living room and rode my Stingray bike back home. And for over a year, from the moment I left those kids on the living room floor, I had no friends at all. Love and their emptiness. The social engineers proved my father right. They didn't want to touch the world. One day I was outside in my yard when I heard my dog bark. One bark and nothing more. But in that one sound I knew something was so very wrong. My dog slept at the end of my bed, nuzzled up to me in the coldest winter. I knew his language. I knew what he felt. And he knew the sadness I felt from having no friends at 13. I ran to the front of the house. My dog was barking at one of the social engineers, who now influences so much of the financial world. This man was jogging. He carried a rock in each hand. They were the first things I noticed. And then I felt, that his skinny body ran filled with rage and unhappiness. As soon as he heard my dog bark, he stopped and threw one of the rocks and hit my dog. The rock broke his rib cage. I could hear the break. I could feel the hurt. My dog cried, and that sound went through me as if it were I who had been hit. The social engineer kept on running, his angry, awkward gait so unhealthy. I followed him. I didn't know what to do. He was an adult, and I was taught respect. He sensed me following him and stopped. He turned around and screamed at me, "I have another rock for you too." I said, "Why did you do it? Why did you hurt my dog? He wouldn't have hurt you." And he looked at me with such hate, as if I were nothing, as if I were absolutely nothing. And he continued running into your life and the lives of millions of others. And I stood there in the middle of my street, knowing what my little dog was feeling, for we are connected in a deeper way than I can ever explain with words. I knew he was having trouble breathing. I ran back to him, and as I ran, I told my little dog that I was sorry, that I should have been there to stop the rock. My father buried my dog in his garden. He said that it was a safe place, and that my dog would always be able to see my room.